actually two stories about where it came from, and both of them are true. First, I had written a series called Unwind. Has anybody read Unwind? Okay, so a lot of you know Unwind. I wrote Unwind, which is this dark dystopian story about a world where teenagers that nobody wants are used for their body parts. I mean, the rule in that is 100% of you has to be used. So it poses the question, if 100% of you is still alive as part of somebody else, can an argument be made to say that you're still alive? So it sort of posed a lot of questions like that. It came out the same year as The Hunger Games, and when I wrote it, teen dystopia wasn't the thing. It became a genre. The genre kind of grew around it until I was being introduced as teen dystopian author Neal Shusterman. Now I always try to defy being, put into a genre. I'm always trying to break the boundaries between genres. So after about 10 years of nothing but teen dystopia, I didn't want to do teen dystopia anymore. I wanted to try to approach science fiction from a different perspective. So I started to think about what made a dystopian story, a dystopian. And I realized that all dystopian stories have the same basic thing in common. The world has gone wrong. The world has taken a dark path, and it's up to the main characters to fix it. So we've seen that hundreds of times. What we haven't seen is what happens when the world goes right. What happens when we get everything that we want, in the way that we want it? So I started looking at all the things that we want out of this world. We want a world without war. We want a world without poverty, without hunger, without racism. We want a world where we've defeated all of these dread diseases. We want a world where ultimately we have everything that we wish for when it comes to artificial intelligence. So I started to do all of this research as to where things were heading, and rather than looking at the worst case scenarios, all the fears, I started to look at all the best case scenarios and what our real hopes are for actually accomplishing. And as I started going down that Google rabbit hole, I kept being led to all of these life extension websites. There is all of this research going on all around the world about extending life and how we can live longer, how we could even stop the aging process. Because, how much money do we all spend on products to keep us younger? Cream for our faces, Botox for our foreheads, and all of this stuff. What happens if you could just turn off the genes so you don't have to worry about that? You just don't age. So once we figure that out, however, it's going to be like we let the genie out of the bottle. Suddenly, it's going to be possible to live forever. So I started thinking about what happens in a world where humanity is immortal. Well, one of the first things I realized is population was going to be a problem. It already is. The world is barely sustainable at this point. There are twice as many people alive now than when I was born, and it's only going to get worse. If people stop dying, the population is going to explode. So I realized that in this world where we've solved this problem of aging, people are still going to have to die, but nature is no longer going to be providing that service for us. So in a world where people don't die naturally, how do we make that decision if we've broken the cycle of life? So I started to kind of come up with a way. It's all part of the world-building process. Okay, I set up this rule. People live forever. People are going to have to die. How am I going to decide how to do that? So I thought, well, maybe the computers could decide. If AI is so intelligent and has all of this wisdom, it should be able to make the decision. But that just sounded dystopian. The Matrix or Terminator, the machines making the decisions for us. I realized that a truly wise machine would know that human life is not its problem, not its business. It should be left to us. And so, left in our hands, I guess the government could decide. No, that's even scarier. And then I thought, in a perfect world, the Jedi would decide. The Jedi of death. What would the Jedi of death be like? They would be these characters who are, walked around in these very distinctive robes. Everybody would know them, be able to see them from a mile away. Everybody would be terrified of them, but also in awe of them. Everybody would love them, but also, be frightened by them. They would be like the celebrities of this world, and they were the ones who had the absolute decision of who should live and who should die. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. They would be wise, and they would be enlightened. But, when you have that much power, there's bound to be people who get in there who should not have that power, who abuse that power. And so that was the beginnings of the story. So that was the story of where it came from. And my first event that I spoke at was the week the book was published, and I had all of my talking points down. I knew what I was going to say when I was asked where I came up with this idea. I was on a panel with several other authors, and the first question that the moderator asked was not, where did you get this idea? The first question that the moderator asked was, what was going on in your life when you came up with this idea? I was not prepared to answer that question. So I had to think about it. I had to go back in time and figure out exactly when did I come up with Scythe. And then when I realized where it was, like right around in the middle of 2013, it occurred to me exactly what was going on in my life. In late 2012, my mom had suffered a stroke, a very, very serious one that left her in a locked-in state. She lost complete control of her body. She couldn't speak. She couldn't eat. All she could do was blink. And sometimes she seemed to be blinking in response to our questions, other times not. She was in the hospital for several months, and finally I took her into my home on hospice. And that's where she was for another 6 months. And it was very clear that this was it for her. There was no improvement from this. The rest of her life, whatever was left, was going to be in this state. So about 6 or 7 months into that, the hospice doctor examined her and came to my father and me and said, maybe it's time you thought about letting her go. And so my father and I discussed it, and we agreed that it was time. And so I had to turn off my mom's feeding tube. The doctor said that she would pass peacefully within a week. But my mom was a very strong woman. She went on for 29 days. She passed away on her 79th birthday. And everybody told us how horrible this was for us, for her. And I thought about that. Would it have been better if she died in a car accident? Would it have been better if she had cancer and wasted away slowly and painfully? Would it have been better if she had Alzheimer's and lost who she was? You know what? There is no easy way to lose your parent. And yet, it's something that we all will go through at one point or another. But I want to tell you about my mom's last day. The hospice nurse was there at this point 24/7, and they know within minutes of when someone's going to pass. The nurse came upstairs at 5 in the morning, woke me up, woke my father up, and told us that it was time. So we went downstairs. I held my mother's one hand, my father held her other hand. We stroked her forehead, telling her that it was okay to go, that we were going to be okay, that we loved her. And then the nurse, after about 10 minutes, took the stethoscope away from her heart and said, she's gone. Now, I don't know about you, but leaving this world while being held by the two people you love most in the world is not the worst way to go. And the next story that I came up with is a story about people whose job it was to end people's lives with compassion. Wow, I never made that connection until I was asked. And after that panel, I went back and I reread Scythe, and I found all of those places where very clearly I was working through what happened with my mom. All those times that Scythe Faraday, with love and compassion, ended people's lives. That was me. That was me and my mother. Didn't know it at the time. Many times as writers, we don't know what compels us to tell a story. All that we know is that story is screaming inside of us to be told. And so, after the fact, I understood where I was coming from when I wrote Scythe. Now, that was the impetus for the story. And of course, the story took a very sort of epic direction. I'm very pleased with how well the books have been received. When Thunderhead came out, the first emails that I started getting the day that it was published was, I read Thunderhead in one day, where's the next one? And people furious for how I left at the end of Thunderhead, knowing that there was going to be at least a year until the third book came out. My hope with Thunderhead was that I wanted to leave you on a cliffhanger, but also leave you feeling satisfied but wanting more. So I hope that I achieved that. I hope you weren't too angry with me in how I ended Thunderhead. The Toll, how many of you have already read The Toll? Okay, so quite a lot of you. I knew from the very beginning where The Toll was ending. How it got there was a journey, and figuring out, new characters came about, the path of that journey, but I ultimately knew where it was going And there are things layered in both the first book and the second book that are pointing to where the story goes. So if you look back through them, you'll find all of those little things that are sort of hinting at it. But I also didn't want it to be predictable. I wanted it to sort of catch you blindsided when you saw where that story was going, and I hope that you guys found it a satisfying conclusion to the series. I'd like to do a reading from The Toll. One of my favorite chapters, but also one of the most messed up ones.
A lot to choose from.
Thank you. This, bit of a spoiler, but for those of you who haven't read it, Rowan has been captured, and Goddard is planning a gleaning in front of a huge audience in a stadium. The gleaning was scheduled for 7 in the evening, but people had arrived early. There were Scythes and ordinary citizens in the crowd, and although the Scythes did have a special entrance, they had been encouraged by Goddard to sit in among the rabble. "This is a golden public relations opportunity," Goddard had told them. "Smile and say kind things. Listen attentively to their twaddle and pretend to care. Maybe even grant some immunity." Many followed the directive, but some could not bring themselves to and sat only with other sides. Rowan, under heavy guard, was taken directly to a large staging area with access directly onto the field. The woodpile they had prepared for him was a 3-story pyramid that appeared to be made out of gathered branches, like a random collection of stacked driftwood. But closer inspection proved everything to be part of an intricately engineered design. The branches weren't just stacked, but nailed in place, and the whole thing was on a huge rolling platform like a parade float. The very center was hollowed out, and in the hollow was a stone pillar to which Rowan was tightly secured by fire-resistant bindings. The pillar was on a lift that would raise Rowan to the top of the pyramid, revealing him to the crowd at the right moment. Then Goddard himself would light it. "This baby is not your ordinary pyre," explained the tech in charge as he wanded off Rowan's pain nanites. "I was part of the team that designed this beauty. There are actually 4 kinds of wood here. Ash wood for an even burn, Osage orange for heat, Rowan wood for, well, obvious reasons, and a few pockets of knotty pine for a nice crackle." The tech checked the tweaker's readout, confirming that Rowan's pain nanites had been shut down, then got back to explaining the wonders of the death float, like a kid at the science fair. "Oh, and you're going to love this," he said. "The branches on the outer rim have been treated with potassium salts, so they'll burn violet. Then farther up, it's calcium chloride, so they'll burn blue, and so on and so forth, through all the colors of the spectrum." Then he pointed at the black robe that the guards had forcibly put Rowan in. "And that robe has been infused with strontium chloride, so it burns deep red. You'll be better than New Year's Eve fireworks." "Gee, thanks," Rowan said flatly. "Too bad I won't get to see it." "Oh, you will," the tech said cheerily. "There's an exhaust fan built into the base that will suck all the smoke away, so everyone will get a good view, even you." Then he took out a piece of brown cloth. "This is a gun cotton gag," the tech told him. "It's quick burning, and it'll incinerate right off the moment it's exposed to heat." Then he stopped himself, finally realizing that Rowan didn't need or want to know these things. A quick-burning gag that allowed people to hear him scream was not the kind of accessory he could get enthused about. Now Rowan was glad they hadn't offered him a last meal because he was way too nauseated to have held it down. Behind the tech, Scythe Rand entered the snarl of branches. Even the prospect of her was better than a blow-by-blow description of his dazzling incineration. "You're not here to talk to him," Rand snapped. Immediately the tech caved like a scolded pup. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Give me the gag and get lost." "Yes, Scythe Rand. Sorry again. Anyway, he's good to go." He gave her a thumbs up. She grabbed the gag, and he retreated with his shoulders hunched. "How much longer?" Rowan asked Rand. "It's about to start," she told him. "A few speeches and you're on." Rowan found he had no heart left to banter with her. He could not be cavalier about this anymore. "Will you watch?" he asked, "or look away?" He didn't know why he cared, but he did. Rand didn't answer him. Instead, she said, "I'm not sorry to see you die, Rowan, but I'm annoyed by how it's going down. Frankly, I just want it to be over." "So do I," he told her. "I'm trying to figure out if it's worth knowing what's going to happen, or if it would have been better not to know." He took a moment, then asked, Did Tiger know? She took a step back from him. I'm not letting you play your little head games on me anymore, Rowan. No games, he said honestly. I just want to know, did you tell him what was happening to him before you took his body? Did he have at least a few moments to make peace with it? No, she told him. He never knew. He thought he was about to be ordained as a scythe. Then we put him under and that was that. Rowan nodded. Kind of like dying in his sleep. What? It's how they say all mortals want it to go. In their sleep. Peacefully. Without ever knowing. I guess it makes sense. Rowan supposed he said too much because Rand put the gag on and tightened it. Once the flames reach you, try to breathe them in, she told him. It'll go faster for you if you do. Then she left without looking back. As far as Goddard was concerned, this day was just as important as the day he revealed himself at Conclave and accepted his nomination for High Blade. Even more important because of the reach. The event would stream out to billions, not just a gathering of scythes in Conclave. The reverberations of tonight would be felt for a long, long time, and the scythedoms that had yet to align with him would have little choice but to do so. Support was growing in leaps and bounds now that he focused most gleaning on the margins of society. Ordinary citizens had no great love of the fringe anyway, and as long as one wasn't part of that frayed edge that needed trimming, one needn't worry about gleaning in Goddard's world. Of course, with the population ever growing, there was no shortage of people to push to the margins. It was, he had come to realize, a matter of evolution. Not natural selection, because nature had become weak and toothless. Intelligent selection was more like it, with Goddard and his acolytes at the helm of the intelligentsia. As the hour neared 7 and the sky became dark, Goddard cracked his knuckles repeatedly and bounced his knees, his body expressing a youthful impatience that didn't show on his face. The anticipation of the crowd was palpable. Not so much cheers and whoops as gasps and a building rumble. Even unlit, the pyre was a sight to behold. The way its branches caught the light. A lit torch waited a safe distance, ready to be touched to the corner of the pyre by Goddard at the proper moment. As the other speeches began, Goddard ran his own speech through his mind. He had studied the greatest addresses in history, those of Roosevelt, King, Demosthenes, Churchill. His would be short and sweet, but full of quotable moments, the kind that would be engraved in stone. Hammerstein's speech began. He was perfectly mournful and lugubrious. Pickford was regal and eloquent, Tizoc direct and incisive, and MacPhail's gratitude for those who made this day possible felt honest and real. Goddard rose and approached the pyre. He wondered if Rowan knew the honor that Goddard was bestowing on him today, cementing his place in history. From now until the end of all things, the world would know Rowan's name. He'd be studied by school children everywhere. Today he would die, yet in a very real sense, he would also become immortal, belonging to the ages, in a way that few are. Goddard touched the button, and the lift raised Rowan from within the pyre to its peak. The rumble of the crowd grew. People stood, hands pointed. Goddard began. Honorable scythes and respected citizens, today we commit humanity's last criminal to the cleansing fire of history. Rowan Damisch, who called himself Scythe Lucifer, stole the light of so many. But today we take back that light and use it as a clear and ever-present beacon of our future. There was a tap on his shoulder. He almost didn't feel it. A new age where scythes with measured joy shape our great society, gleaning those who have no place in our glorious tomorrow. Again, a tap at his shoulder, more insistent this time. Could it be that someone was interrupting his address? Who would dare do such a thing? He turned to see Constantine behind him, upstaging him with that eye-assaulting crimson robe, even more gaudy now that it bore rubies. Your Excellency, he whispered, there appears to be a problem. Problem? In the middle of my speech, Constantine? You should look for yourself. Then Constantine drew his attention to the pyre. Rowan squirmed and strained against his bonds. He tried to scream through the gag, but the screams would not be fully realized until the gag burned off, and then Goddard realized. The figure atop the unlit pyre was not Rowan. The face was familiar, but it wasn't until Goddard looked to the giant screens placed around the stadium, which showed the man's anguished expression close up, that he realized who this was. It was the technician. The one in charge of preparing Rowan for his execution. Goddard felt his body's reaction before his mind could truly grasp what he was seeing. It came as a tingling in his extremities, a churning in his gut, and an aching tightness in the small of his back. Fury surged upward with volcanic intensity until his head began to throb. His grand moment was not just robbed from him. It was subverted, twisted upon itself like something obscene. The rumbles from the audience sounded different than they had only a second ago. Was that laughter he heard? Were they laughing at him? Constantine whispered in his ear, "I've ordered the gates locked, and the entire Blade Guard has been alerted. We'll find him." But that didn't matter. It was ruined. They could drag Rowan back and hurl him onto the pyre, but it would make no difference. Goddard's shining moment would be the greatest casualty of the day, unless... Ian knew things were heading to a very bad place the moment she saw that imbecile atop the pyre. Goddard would have to be handled. For when his anger took control, all bets were off. It was bad enough before, but ever since acquiring Tiger's body, those youthful impulses, the sudden endocrine surges, gave Goddard a terrible new dimension. Adrenaline and testosterone might have been charming when managed by a harmless blank slate like Tiger Salazar. They were merely winds beneath a kite. But under Goddard, those same winds were a tornado, which meant that he would have to be handled, like a beast that had broken out of its cage. "The feeds have been cut," Ian told him. "It's no longer streaming. We're on damage control now." "You can turn this around, Robert," she said, cajoling him as best she could. "Make them think this is intentional, that it's just a part of the show." The look on his face terrified her. She wasn't even sure he'd heard her until he said, "Intentional. Yes, Ian, that's exactly what I'll do." He raised the mic, and Ian stepped back. Perhaps Constantine had been right. It was always in these moments of dismay that she could corral him, control him, fix what was broken before it became irreparable. She took a deep breath and waited, along with everyone else, to hear what he was going to say. "Today was meant to be a day of reckoning," Goddard began, spitting the words into the microphone as he spoke. "You, all of you who came here today nurturing a thirst for blood. You, whose hearts quicken at the prospect of a man being burned alive before your very eyes. You, did you think I would indulge you? Did you believe we sights were so base as to pander to your morbid curiosity, offering you a circus of carnage for your entertainment?" Now he screamed at them through gritted teeth. "How dare you? Only sights may take pleasure in the ending of life, or have you forgotten?" He paused, letting that sink in, letting them feel the depth of their transgression. Had Rowan not vanished, he would have been happy to give them their show, but they must never know that. "No, Scythe Lucifer is not here today," he continued. "But you, who were so eager to witness the spectacle, are now the object of my eye. This was not a judgment on him. It was a judgment on you, who have on this day damned yourselves. The only way back from perdition is penance. Penance and sacrifice. Therefore I have selected you on this day to be an example for the world." Then he looked to the 1,000 scythes dotting the audience of the stadium. "Glean them," he ordered with contempt for the crowd so great that he bit his own lip. "Glean them all." Thank you. Oh, it's fun being Goddard. He is such a bad guy. Well, I would like to open it up to questions. If anybody has any questions about these books or any of the other books or anything that you would like to ask. Right here.
I would love to know the thought process behind Dry, which right now is one of my most favorite that you have written.
Oh, thank you very much. Dry actually started when my son Jared and I were sitting in traffic in Los Angeles. And the traffic, there must have been a major accident right ahead of us because the traffic just stopped moving completely. And then after like half an hour, people started getting out of their cars to see what was going on. And he had been working on another project where he had interviewed people from the government, from FEMA, to talk about disasters. And one of the things that he said was that one of the first problems in any disaster are that the roads become impassable. And as soon as people start to get out of their cars, that's the end of it. That then the roads become a parking lot.
That's right.
And it's like in Katrina, they had to bulldoze the abandoned cars off of the roads. And we thought about the types of disasters, the type of situations that could lead to this. One of the things he mentioned was this idea called 3 days to animal. That whenever we have a disaster that takes away a basic human need, it really only takes 3 days for society to start to crumble. And we sort of go back to our animal instincts. Either we're wolves or sheep, predators or prey. And we started talking about the types of disasters that could bring that on. And times in history when we've seen that, when we've seen looting and blackouts and things like that. But it doesn't always happen. It doesn't seem to be entirely predictable as to how people are going to behave. And then we talked about, because, you could do without electricity. You can do without the internet. You can do without your phones. There's only 3 things you really can't do without: food, water, and air. And we single out water because, you could go without food for a few weeks. But water, you can really only go without water for a very, very brief time, for just a few days. And so we thought, well, what if Southern California ran out of water? It kind of has. I mean, Southern California is a desert. The only reason why there's anything there is because the water is brought in elsewhere. So we started to research where the water comes from and how it all works. And the more research we did, the scarier it got, because, it's almost like these shadowy agencies dealing with the water. There's a huge amount of corruption. Southern California, the water between Arizona, California, and Nevada are all controlled by like this triumvirate of organizations that are always at each other's throats for the same water that's coming from the Colorado River. So we thought, well, what would happen if the water supply to Southern California was just cut off? Well, the government would start to redirect water to emergency services, neighborhoods would be cut off, and people would be on their own. How long could a community survive without running water? How many water bottles are there at any given time in Southern California? How fast could you get water to that area if the water is shut off? And we realized that this was a disaster waiting to happen. So we just sort of extrapolated what could happen and where it could go, and how quickly everything could start to break down once the water was turned off. Scary thing, after we wrote the book, before the book was published, we had turned in our first draft, and then there was this big announcement from South Africa that Cape Town was about to run out of water. They had 3 months, and during that time, all the things that happened in our story that we extrapolated were actually happening in South Africa. And the whole idea of them planning, to how to ration it, and they were going to have, military take control, and there would be, martial law would be declared. All of these things were actually going on, and it was really scary to see the real world mimic what we had just invented. Ultimately, they got a little bit of rain, and they were able to stretch that out, and now, but the thing is, their day zero keeps being pushed back, but it's always right ahead. Same thing in Athens, Greece, and dozens of cities around the world, and Australia is having this problem terribly, and with the fires. So it's a world problem. It's all, it's a climate change issue where some places are getting no water and some places are getting much more water than they ever used to get. Everything is changing, and we wanted to tell this story about what climate change does on a very personal level. And what we realized that we were writing, while we were writing it, we realized that what we're really writing is a zombie apocalypse. But a real one. Not Walking Dead science fiction, but something that could really happen, because when you've gone for 2 days without water, when your whole community has, you just become a water zombie. You would do anything for that water. So we sort of took it in that direction. It's very scary because it's real. Mm-hmm.
Since we're talking about dry, what was your son and yours process for writing the book together? How did you guys do that?
Our process for writing together was really an organic process. I mean, he didn't take one part and I took another. What we did is, he writes scripts, and so he knows story very well. And we had written a couple of things before, but this is the first time we were sitting down to write a novel. So we kind of outlined the story, and then we went to the chapter and figured out everything that was going to happen in the chapter, the arc of the chapter, all the main character points, and then one of us would go write that chapter. Now the story is told in 4 characters' points of view, first person. So we took turns in that. So if I wrote one character's point of view for this chapter, the next time we got back to that character, he would take over and just continue in that voice. So it wasn't like he did one character and I did another. We interchanged. It was just matching the voice from the previous time that character was telling the story. And then he would write it, then I would rewrite what he wrote, or if I wrote something, he would rewrite that. His strengths were the action sequences and the plotting. My strengths were the characters and dialogue, and so we sort of found our places together in working on the story. It was, when we look back on it, we can't remember who wrote what.
You talked about how your mother's death sort of seeped into your writing without you even realizing it. And I read a lot of things for escapism because I'm a journalist for a living. To what extent does the current political situation and things going on seep into the writing of The Toll? Because I saw lots of parallels, but I'm also a journalist, so I don't know if I'm reading into that or...
Oh, there are a lot of parallels to what's going on in current politics. And there are a couple of wink wink nudge nudge moments. Like there's a one moment. Well, there's a one moment where one of the characters, one of the undersides says, when people are trying to escape from mid-America because of Goddard's policy of because of the mass gleanings that he's doing, and his underside says, maybe we should build a wall to keep people from getting out. And Goddard says, don't be ridiculous, only idiots build walls. But also the idea of Goddard himself. I mean, he is a self-serving, narcissistic abuser of power. And, he is modeled after people like that throughout history and in current day. Another question, yes.
I love the diversity in your characters. I was wondering what inspiration you had for Jericho specifically.
For the character of Jericho. I knew from the beginning that by the time I got to the 3rd book, I needed to have a gender-neutral character. For those of you who haven't read it, I won't tell you why, but it was very necessary to have a gender-neutral character. And so I had to come up with a character that was interesting and unique and fit the time, rather than being a model of someone from today. So I tried to figure out who this character was and sort of take some license with coming up with the idea of this character. So I had the idea of that Jericho Jerry came from one of the charter regions, Madagascar, where every child was raised without a gender. And only at 18, when you became adult, could you choose a gender, or you never had to choose. So the idea was, growing up, the idea of being one or the other was so foreign to them that it was just something that, that was their normal. And so I wanted to